Welcome to this podcast from the Medical Journal of Australia. My name is Sally Block, the MJA's news and online editor. It's NAIDOC week and the MJA's special issue on Indigenous health. The MJA acknowledges the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we live and work across Australia. This podcast was recorded on the lands of the Wangal people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Associate Professor Paul Saunders is a proud Biripi man whose family comes from the mid-north coast of New South Wales. He is the Associate Professor and Academic Lead for Indigenous Health in the Graduate School of Medicine at the University of Wollongong. He is one of the guest editorial team and he joins me now. Can you tell us about this special issue of the MJA and what it means for Black space in the Australian scholarly community?
Yeah, so this is really important. I feel really honoured to be involved in this. Actually, it's a big step forward, particularly where the MJA has come from in its established roots in the Australian continent, and the role of medical journals in Australia in perpetuating stereotypes and inferiority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples through things like phrenology, eugenics. It's a really big step forward, and it says a lot about the commitment to reconciliation and self-determination from an MJA perspective for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population. So it's extremely important, this special issue, and it's more than just an issue. It's quite symbolic in terms of allowing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to control the medical space, and particularly given a space that's very westernized, a space that's very biomedically centered and focused, to allow Indigenous knowledges to permeate that at an equal platform is extremely important for realizing that there's more than one way to do things. There's more than one way to look at health and medicine. And in fact, what happens when we allow Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing into this space is we realise that the biomedical Western scientific field of medicine is very circumscribed. It's quite narrow, and it doesn't centre or value alternative perspectives, whether they're Indigenous or not.
Your perspective and what you've been involved in is new guidelines for medical education providers that has been released by the Australian Medical Council. So how does that tie in with what you were just saying?
Yeah, so the Australian Medical Council, similar to the MJA, have engaged in this process of truth-telling, of reconciliation, and true, genuine reconciliation, where there's an understanding that the way things have been done have been quite limited and have been very exclusionary. And now there's a process of self-reflection that has begun within the Australian Medical Council that has allowed progress and has allowed this open-mindedness to consider the importance of Indigenous control over this space, which is extremely important, which is something that has been called for a number of years. This is nothing new. You know, our elders, our ancestors have been calling for self-determination for a long time, because no one knows this space better than us as blackfellas. So the Australian Medical Council, as a result of this and a result of allowing Indigenous peoples in, not just in, but to control this space, they've revolutionised their standards. Their standards for primary medical education providers has transformed immensely, and that process is now underway for specialist medical colleges, with plans to then focus on the pre-vocational space and that space between primary medical education and specialty training. So the standards look completely different now. What it has done is enabled that Indigenous voice to permeate medical schools and to have a level of governance that is required to contribute to the next generation of medical professionals really, really understanding what are the needs of Indigenous peoples, what are the diverse needs of Indigenous peoples, and how can they facilitate meeting those needs through their medical practice. And then, of course, that leads to greater Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander patient experiences within healthcare settings, which then has a flow-on effect, which is thought to improve health outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples.
For people who aren't Indigenous, I mean, these concepts are new things. Like, we take it for granted that we are well overrepresented in health and in health outcomes, in good health outcomes. How important is it for First Nations peoples to have these kinds of guidelines so that it raises their experience of health outcomes?
Yeah, so the new standards that the AMC have recently released will have a flow-on effect, and they're extremely important. I think one of the things that we often discount is an understanding of how things are interpreted and how people perceive particular experiences, but also perceive different knowledges and understandings of particular standards and words and whatnot. And one thing that has been quite challenging is that cultural safety as a concept is quite subjective, because it's judged by and informed by the actual patient, and obviously one person's cultural safety is not equal to another person's cultural safety. And so for non-Indigenous peoples to understand these concepts can be quite challenging, because they don't conform to these objective ways of knowing that much of the medical field encourages or promotes. So I think what's really important is that there is truth telling in all of this. And really that's the starting point, is understanding your positionality in this country as a non-Indigenous person, where you stand, what privileges you hold, but also ways in which you understand knowledge and ways in which you validate and privilege knowledge is something that needs to be interrogated. So we talk a lot about self-reflection, and it's probably a word that gets overused and has probably lost some of its value in many ways. But true self-reflection with an aim to develop self-reflexivity is really about sitting there questioning everything that you know and everything that you do, and how others may perceive things differently and how others may do things differently. And just because someone does something differently, it doesn't mean that your way of doing it is better. And I think that this is the mindset that we really need to tap into, because there's an understanding within the Western world that Western knowledges are superior, and that Western knowledges have advanced the contemporary society that we live in. And while that certainly may be true, there's also Indigenous knowledges and other knowledges that have contributed to that as well. So it's finding validity across multiple perspectives, or what we refer to as epistemic pluralism. And I think that really underpins a lot of what we aim to achieve through medical education. Things like critical consciousness, things like epistemic pluralism. I think it's these foundational concepts to be able to really appreciate and demonstrate that allows you then to enact what is essentially culturally responsive practice in medical settings and in other healthcare settings as well. So it's a process, it's an ongoing process. It's something that doesn't stop. It's not something you can do in a workshop or an online module and tick it off and say, hey, I'm culturally safe now. I think what gets lost is that everything else that we do in medicine, medical education, is very much competency based, and this does not align with that. And I think that that's where a lot of the challenges lie and a lot of the challenges remain.
What needs to happen for that cultural safety to exist within medicine?
So there are a number of elements to that. The first of which is that there needs to be cultural safety within the institutions that educate our future health professionals, our future medical professionals. And what I mean by that is that the environments in which these students are learning need to be culturally safe. There needs to be demonstration that the faculty and the non-Indigenous staff have gone through this process and are still going through this process. I think it is quite difficult to expect students to develop in this area when the staff that are teaching them aren't doing the same thing. Beyond that, there's an element of community control that needs to occur throughout their medical education. So they need to be seeing community need to be coming in. There needs to be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives that these students need to hear about and they need to understand about and they need to appreciate within the context of that community why these peoples hold these perspectives. And even if they don't align with their own, or even if they don't align with the non-Indigenous community's perspectives, there needs to be an understanding of why they are different. And that needs to really be appreciated. Beyond that, I think it's just a willingness to engage in that critical self-reflection, in that critical self-critique, and there needs to be an element of cultural humility that includes an understanding that you're not expert, you don't know everything, and that can be quite difficult, I think, for medical students and medical practitioners because they're situated as experts and they often take that label and apply it across their multiple roles within their life beyond that of the medical practitioner or the medical student. So allowing medical students or encouraging medical practitioners to be vulnerable in that respect is quite important because that then opens the door for them to learn more. Because if you're an expert, then you don't feel you need to learn more. But if you challenge that label, then you are open to further learning, and this is a constant, lifelong learning journey.
What structural things need to be put in place so there's some sort of organised learning for people who aren't Indigenous?
Yeah, so this is a really important question, and it's one when we think about it from a structural perspective, this needs to occur in primary school and in high school. These learnings and this truth telling and the challenging of these dominant narratives needs to occur early on, because if students are coming into medicine, whether it's an undergraduate or a postgraduate degree, and all they've heard for the last 18, 20 plus years of their life is the dominant narrative and it hasn't been challenged, for them to challenge that at that age can be quite difficult, because this is the narrative that they've heard all of their lives. Whereas if we start to do this earlier on in their educational journey, then as they come through medical education, as they go out to become trainees and then on to fellows, and then on to supervisors of these trainees, it becomes much easier, because what has been challenged when they have been younger becomes the norm, which is really what we need. And it's not about it's not about flipping it on its head and saying Indigenous knowledges are more important, or they should be dominant or they're superior. It's about finding validity in each of those perspectives and each of those knowledge systems, and understanding that each of them has benefit and each of them can contribute to creating a more just society, to creating a society where knowledges, whether they're Western, whether they're Indigenous or otherwise, can contribute to benefiting our society more broadly as a whole. So it's not an easy question to answer, to be honest. I think that it really needs to begin a lot sooner, and particularly with the understanding that cultural safety and the development of cultural responsiveness and cultural humility, they're all ongoing, lifelong processes. So if we consider that, then they really need to start much earlier on than adulthood.
And I guess that's where the government needs to come in behind that and make that education compulsory.
Yes, look, there are advances. I would use that term loosely in the pre-tertiary education space in primary school, in secondary school in Australia, where there have been inclusions of Aboriginal knowledges. Now, they may not have been included in the most appropriate way, and there are still issues with that. there's still refinements that need to occur with that. But the fact that they are included now, I think, says a lot, and certainly tells me that we're moving in the right direction. The work is far from done, but to be able to have that included and then continue that on in tertiary education, post-secondary school education and training, regardless of what those pathways look like, I think is really important. And that's really the framework that we need and the foundation that we need to be able to realise the goal that we want, which is cultural safety, whether that's in healthcare or otherwise. I think environments need to be culturally safe, particularly those customer-facing service roles and sectors are really important, that they do consider and centre cultural safety for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, because it has an impact on not just healthcare, but employment, education outcomes, and a lot of the targets related to closing the gap. And that, of course, needs to be underpinned by the self-determination. Aboriginal peoples need to determine what that pathway needs to look like, and what should be included and how it should be included. And more importantly, the narrative needs to change around Western knowledges dominating others and being superior.
You said in your perspective that often First Nations peoples represent often invisible yet strong threads entwined to hold many community relationships, medical schools, and societies together. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, so when we talk about the inclusion of Indigenous peoples and knowledges, what we're actually doing is creating the conduit between the community and the academic or the white or the dominant non-Indigenous institutions, because there is a knowledge gap, quite significant knowledge gap, and an interpretation and an understanding of what local Indigenous communities want and what they need to be able to thrive and to be able to allow them to practice their culture and enact their culture, and be proud of their culture when it's often targeted, it's often attacked. And Indigenous peoples situated in these institutions allow for that. It's almost a knowledge translation, as in terms of what needs to be done and how it needs to be done based on what the communities are telling us, what our own communities are telling us that needs to be done. And beyond that, it's also around, and I'll use the context of the new AMC standards for primary medical education, it's around that translation. So the the deans of medical schools and the non-Indigenous faculty can read these new standards, and they often don't appreciate the complexity of them. They often think that they're straightforward, A plus B equals C, but often it's not the case, and often there's a lot of time that needs to be taken to be able to meet these standards as well. So it's not just about meeting the standard, but it's about what do we need to be able to start engaging in this standard so that we can meet it. And often what that is around, we need to develop relationships with the community. They need to be reciprocal. And it's the Indigenous peoples that are situated within these institutions that often enable that, and that often guide these institutions in terms of undertaking appropriate engagement with communities. And when it's done effectively, then what you have is a mutually beneficial reciprocal relationship built with a non-Indigenous institution and a First Nations community.
What would be your greatest wish for the best outcome for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander healthcare?
Look, the best outcome would be to see the gap that we always talk about closed. I think there are a lot of theoretical issues with that that I won't go into, but I think what's really important to be able to achieve that is, we often talk about the development of medical practitioners, the development of students on their journey and what that looks like. But what we often don't consider is what's needed to start that journey. do we just assume that everyone is ready to engage and start that journey? I think there are certain things that need to be considered. Why do some start it earlier than others? Why are some more engaged than others? Why are some more willing than others? So I think what I would like to see is a greater open-mindedness of people to engage in that, to challenge their truths or their beliefs about what's right, what's wrong, what knowledge is superior. I think what we need before we even consider about how the journey should look like or what it should look like is, what do we need for people to start engaging in it? Because that's often where I see the challenge is. People are not willing to engage in it for one reason or another, whether that's I don't have time to do it, I don't believe in this, I think it's pointless, I don't see the relevance of it. I think once people start to become open-minded, start to question, start to become a bit more self-reflective, then they find that relevance, they find that time, and they understand that this doesn't just impact relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, it actually has an impact and a beneficial impact on all of the relationships that these people have in their life, whether they're with, First Nations peoples or otherwise. And I think that appreciating the value in that is something that we really need to start allowing people and enabling people to understand and to appreciate.
Thank you to my special guest, Associate Professor Paul Saunders. You can find more podcasts on our website at mja.com.au or wherever you find your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening.